I'm Sarah Jane, and you guys can call me SJ or Sarah or anything you really want, actually. And I recently just completed my degree in biomedical science. So I really love science and the way it illuminates the world around us. I especially love how the details and intricacies of nature, for me, point not only to a beautiful design, and therefore a great designer, but also show me who the great designer is. Now, I'm not sure if many of you are art appreciators, but I certainly am, and I'm particularly amazed that by looking closely at a piece of art, you can identify the artist or origin just through its style or the paint stroke, or even their signature, or many other features, really. And just like this, when we look closely at the world around us, it can give us hints about its origin, or even the creator who designed it. For those of you who are believers, I hope that as we zoom in on the phenomenon of bird navigation, we will seek to ask, what does the way God has created birds tell me about his character? All right, so now many of you might be thinking what I initially thought, which is, how can navigational senses of birds point to the existence of a creator God, let alone tell us who he is? And I confess I'm certainly not an expert on this subject of ornithology, which is just the science of birds. In fact, while I think birds can be quite beautiful, more often than not, my thoughts regarding birds have been limited to, don't you dare go near my lunch, or please don't swoop me. But during my research of this topic, which I was so privileged to do, I've been pleasantly surprised and actually really encouraged just by, I guess, all of the things that we can see about these small and fascinating, sometimes really pesky creatures, and how they find their way to the correct destination at the right time. And furthermore, how this journey points us to the heart of the Creator. My hopes for you are that you learn something about how birds know when and where to migrate, even more so, how this phenomenon of avian navigation points to the existence of a design and therefore a great designer. There we go. I'd like to start by just briefly taking a little survey. So I get you to put your hands up if you can find your way to the local grocery store without a GPS. Great, good skill to have. We might take that up a notch, and I want you to put your hands up if you can find your way up to Noosa. Yep, awesome. How about up to Cape York? Great, there's a few less hands. And how about all the way up to Alaska and back? Yeah, well, I didn't think there'd be many of you, if any. And I don't think you'd find that many people at all would have the navigational sense and orientation to make that amazing trip. Yet for thousands of short-tailed shearwater birds, I think we have that over there, or the mutton birds as some of you may know them, this trip is a trip they make yearly every April. They begin their journey flying north from their breeding grounds in South Australia and sort of go towards the Pacific Ocean. They ride the winds past Siberia and Japan and go all the way up to the Arctic Ocean to the north of Antarctica. And then they return to the shores of Australia again for the summer breeding season in September. All right. I think that's pretty incredible, don't you? And to think I get lost coming home from the city, and that is with a GPS, actually. So what is even more incredulous is that these abandoned chicks that are also untaught make this same journey about 2 weeks later after their parents have already embarked on the journey. I think that in itself is amazing because as babies, we are totally reliant on our parents. We have no idea what to do, and yet these chicks are going all the way across the globe, finding the right destination, meeting up with their parents without the guidance of experience or the guidance from other birds. All right, so for the duration of my talk, I hope to take you on a journey alongside the migration of birds by addressing some of the features that they use to make this successful flight. All right, so what do these birds need to make this journey? How about we take a step back and ask what we need when we are going on a trip for the first time. So I'm just going to get you to quickly discuss what you think you need to get to a desired destination in the right time with your neighbour. So I'll just give you 60 seconds to do that. I know that was a quick amount of time. Awesome. Who of you said Google Maps or something of the sort? Yes. Where would we be without Google Maps? We probably actually wouldn't even know, since we wouldn't know where we actually are without it. So just like us, birds have their own sort of Google Maps that is actually written on their very DNA. Just like the instructions of how you get to your desired destination might be written in a coding language on your phone's sort of storage drive, so too every cell in our body has a massive instruction set that is written on its DNA. Part of the Google Maps feature is the little arrow that orientates us so that we know what direction to actually travel in. I doubt very many of you, or some of you might, have or use a compass very often, but these birds actually have several innate compasses, that's internal compasses, that work together to provide them with a sense of direction and orientation. Another thing that is really important is knowing when to leave your house so you can get to your destination on time. So while we might look on the clock on our wall for the time, these birds actually have internal clocks that act as an alarm to tell them when to spread their wings and begin their journey. All right, so those are sort of the three aspects that we will be discussing in a bit of detail today. So that is a clock, a map, and a compass. Awesome. So we're gonna start with the clock, and I probably don't need to get you to raise your hands to ask if you've been late before, because I'm sure at some stage you have been late. This might not be a massive deal. I know for some of us, it might just mean that, for instance, all the best food at a party has been eaten, leaving us with the less desirable food. And honestly, I don't want to downplay that, because I know some of you are very serious about your food. But for birds, leaving their breeding site in the wrong time could be a matter of life or death. So food is important to them too, but while you might have missed out on the mini quiches and have to settle for the savoury pies or vice versa, if birds don't leave early enough, they might starve from the deficiencies in their food supply. So seasonal fluctuations in food supply, like insects, nectar, or seeds, are an important reason why it is essential that birds migrate when they do. However, it is really important to note that while it is a really good reason to migrate, hunger in and of itself doesn't actually drive the migration of birds. This can be observed in the bar-tailed godwits, which are actually fattest right before their migration journey. And we will be discussing that interesting behaviour later. But if seasonal food fluctuation isn't actually the cause of migration, what could it be? The answer is, actually there is many complex factors that drive the timing of the migration of birds. When we go on a trip, the timing of when we might leave is influenced by actually many factors. It might be dependent on a network of things like our work schedule, accommodation availability, or even just the weather. Many other factors might come into play as well. And just like us, the timing of migration is influenced by a host of different influences. And so the two overarching factors, though, are a genetic predisposition and several environmental triggers. But today we will just be really discussing just the genetic predisposition of the timing of migration. So the concept of birds having built-in or innate programs present from birth that determine when and even where they might migrate was first supported by observations made in these caged birds. They were called European blackcaps, where they observed migration-like behaviour and directional movement, even when factors like food and shelter were given and there was ample supply. So this behaviour was actually coined migratory restlessness. And while it actually isn't migration in itself, it is actually an indicator of the captive bird's motivation to migrate. So several studies have actually showed that this migratory restlessness is robustly controlled by innate programs when birds were kept under constant conditions of day length, temperature, and food. Since all of the environmental factors were controlled for, it couldn't have been a learnt behaviour as well. This indicated that the urge to migrate had a strong genetic component. More recent studies actually conducted on the blackcaps again revealed that genetic instructions for migration are largely written on a specific part of the DNA, and this was namely the 80YAP1 gene. All right, so it has actually become clear that migratory behaviours are actually driven by an inbuilt body clock rhythm that runs over a 12-month period. So instead of just having a body clock that is run over 24 hours, this is a clock that runs over 12 months. Being inbuilt, they seem not to be heavily influenced by outside environmental conditions or triggers, such as seasonal temperature changes as well. These rhythms actually derive a variety of physiological changes, which enhance and are controlled in concert with the timing of migration. The times for seasonal activities, such as breeding or molting, are set by the genetically encoded 12-month body clock, which is actually synchronised with ecological conditions through factors like the length of daylight in different months. The genes that control these rhythms are known as circadian locomotor output cycles caput, or clock genes for short. I'll probably just call it clock genes. The part of the genes that have their C-terminal end contain a series of repeated letters called polyglutamide repeats, and they vary between species. So it's actually shown that the variations in length have been associated with differences in timing of these seasonal activities. And this was particularly observed in the long-distance migratory barn swallow called Hirundo rustica. I may have said that wrong, so if anyone knows, you can correct me on that. Where these individuals with the rare clock allele that was actually had the largest number of C-terminal repeats showed delayed reproduction and also molted later. Alternatively, those with alleles that had the least repeats showed earlier migration from their summer breeding grounds and arrived early in their spring colony. So ultimately we see that clock gene polymorphisms, which is just the variation in the letters of the genes, has a significant effect on the phenology or the timing of seasonal activities of birds. It is vital for the time of departure for these migratory birds to be synced with this clock so their bodies are in peak condition for the flight. For instance, in the migratory birds called stonechats, migration follows molting. If they had migrated before molting, the incomplete plumage, or their body covering if you like, would impair their flight capability and increase their overall energy expenditure. Earlier I also mentioned how the bar-tailed godwits were, well, fattest before migration. The behaviour of excessive eating, or hyperphagia, preceding migration is also critically timed so that the bird is in peak condition for flight. The excessive eating prepares the bird for migration by providing sufficient fuel for their flight. While for you and me, eating a big breakfast before a big day might not even be enough to get us to lunchtime, these birds actually have to eat efficiently so that they can travel weeks on end without many pit stops at all, actually. So this also involves efficient fat storage so they can avoid excess weight that might impair their flight capabilities. This efficient fat storage is actually a phenomenon in itself, and sadly we won't get time to discuss that. But suffice to say that birds have many features which prime them for flight at the right time, and it really indicates a very intricate and complex design. I personally think that it is incredible that so many of these physiological changes and behaviours are timed so precisely to fit around migration, that birds migrate every year. This internal clock mechanism actually reminds me of a Bible verse from Jeremiah 8 verse 7, which I'm not sure if you can see that clearly, but it basically says, "Even the stork in the sky knows her appointed seasons, and the dove, the swift and the thrush observe the time of their migration." We won't go into further detail on the physiological changes that effectively prepare and prompt migratory behaviour in birds, but ultimately we can see that there are many factors that dictate the timing of the bird's departure, and many of these are genetically controlled circadian or clock rhythms. All right, so we're gonna take a quick 2 to 3 minutes to form pairs or groups just to discuss something that we've just learnt about the clock system. So I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes just to talk with your neighbours, and then we'll come back for the map. All right. Have we had a good discussion there? Good. All right. So we'll now actually move on to discuss the maps that birds use to navigate to the correct destination. So studies have shown that these maps are inherited genetically from their parents. Particularly compelling are the findings from a team that investigated the migratory routes of these birds called Swainson's thrush, which are split into 2 subspecies, and they actually follow 2 very different migratory routes. The thrush all travel south from British Columbia in Canada, but one subgroup travels along the coast of California to Mexico, and the other group travels over Alabama to Colombia. Both subgroups return to Canada in the spring. They found that some of the birds in these subgroups interbred and actually produced hybrids, which actually is really interesting because they found that the hybrid offspring favoured a migratory route that was somewhere in between those of the parents, and we can kind of see that in the blue there as well. So the migratory route of the parents is the green and the yellow, and sort of the route of the hybrid offspring is in that range of the blue. So that was a pretty awesome finding, and since it was impossible for the birds to learn this middle route, it's fairly clear that these birds were guided by a mixed set of genetic instructions from their parents. We will now discuss these genetic maps with respects to 2 different routes, orthodromes and loxadromes. The orthodrome route, or the Great Circle route, is the shortest distance between 2 points on the globe. A team investigating the flight trajectories of New World shorebirds, which is like sandpipers and plovers, found clear evidence that they fly along orthodromic routes. So that's like the shortest route, using a sun compass for orientation. Birds that use orthodromic routes, however, must continuously change their compass course because their route intersects with successive longitudes. So this is where navigating by Loxadrome routes comes in. So Loxadrome routes have a constant compass course, which assumes a bit more of a simplified orientation mechanism, but they are longer distances than the orthodromic routes. All right, so our next question might be, how do these birds compute these great circle courses? So the answer lies within the use of the bird's inherent compasses. Evidence has been provided for 3 inbuilt compasses in migratory birds. So that's a sun compass, a star compass, and a magnetic compass that they use for orientation. In particular, the sun compass has been implicated in the migratory bird's ability to follow orthodromic routes. The compass allows birds to determine absolute geographical direction with respect to the angle of the incoming sun. To determine this direction, the sun compass must compensate for the apparent movement of the sun across the sky as the Earth spins. So since this is a regular and predictable movement, this compensation can be done with respect to the bird's internal body clock that we actually talked about earlier. The compensation is actually crucial following orthodromic routes, since birds are subject to time shifts, travelling across longitudes to their destination. So you can see how that actually might be really important, that they compensate for those time shifts. Birds also utilise a star compass, which is also called a celestial compass, and this doesn't actually depend on their body clock. It determines absolute geographical direction with respect to the rotation of the night sky. Because of their similarities, the sun and the star compass have been proposed to form one integrated celestial compass system. However, these compasses alone do not describe the ability for juvenile birds to navigate to the correct destination, especially since these compasses require at least partly clear skies to discern direction. A study also showed that pigeons raised without exposure to sunlight retained the ability to successfully navigate to their direct destination, suggesting that the use of a celestial compass system was a learnt behaviour and their navigational ability was not solely dependent on it. So this brings us to the third compass, and probably my favourite compass actually, which is built into the birds and isn't dependent on meteorological conditions. And so this is our magnetic compass. So this compass determines absolute geographical location with respect to the angle of inclination of magnetic field lines. And I'm sure many of you are probably wondering, how on earth does a bird, tell what this information is? And if you are amongst many multidisciplinary scientists who are scratching their heads wondering the same thing. While the mechanism behind this magnetoreception still remains unconfirmed, there are currently 2 leading hypotheses, and I'll only be talking about one today. This hypothesis is the magnetic compass in birds is based on a light-dependent compass mechanism that uses special types of proteins that act as primary sensors, which could be located either in the pineal gland of the brain or the retina of the eye. So here we see a proposed model of the suggested magnetic compass processing pathways in bird brains. So the magnetic information is suggested to be received by special proteins in the bird's eyes and passed to an area in the forebrain called cluster N via this pathway called the thalamofugal visual pathway. Therefore, this light-dependent information has been said to be perceived by the bird brain as a visual impression, which that's pretty awesome. Hey, it's actually seeing the magnetic field lines. That's what they're proposing. However, this hypothesis has not yet been proved, and there are many parts of this idea that still remains very mysterious. So I've just talked about the 3 different compasses that migratory birds use to navigate. But what compass does the bird really use to actually navigate in their journey? Research has shown that while some birds may predominantly use one type of compass, birds often use a combination of these mechanisms, which is especially useful when one of these compass mechanisms is impaired in particular. In fact, in simulations of routes, using these individual compasses, it was found that none of the paths birds flew were accounted by using one of the compasses in isolation. Instead, the information of the compasses are integrated to give a sense of direction. The factors that contribute to the timing and navigation of bird migration are many and more complex than I could adequately explain in such a small time period. It has taken ornithologists many years to characterise some of the mechanisms behind the miraculous phenomenon of bird migration, and I am sure that we will never fully comprehend how these birds fly to the correct destination without having learnt from their parents. It seems clear to me that the complexity and the number of factors that contribute to the innate navigational ability of birds could not have been generated by a random set of events, but could only be a design thought out by the intelligence of a creator. I'll give you another sort of 1 to 2 minutes just to briefly discuss, because we're about to get into sort of a new topic altogether, the field of information science. So just quickly discuss an idea and we will come back with some information science. Awesome. Hope you guys had a good discussion there. Great. As we've already talked about, the migratory behaviour of birds is largely determined by the genetic instructions that they inherited from their parents. These genetic instructions can be likened to a coded message which has to be sent, carried and received, just as you might like to send a letter to a friend. If I wrote the words, "I love birds," on a piece of paper, you would be able to retrieve the meaning from that letter. However, if a 4-year-old child accidentally spilled ink onto a blank paper and gave it to you, it would mean nothing to you. The same materials are used, however, information is present on one and not the other. So where does this information come from? It is not a property of the pen or paper, although I'm sure many students would appreciate a pen that had the information needed for an examination. There is intention, purpose and design by the shapes the ink makes on the paper to form words. The only difference between me writing the words "I love birds" and a child's accidental ink spill is that there was a purpose and an intention and a design. The shapes that the ink makes on the paper to form the letters and the words hold information only because the person writing them has used their intelligence. I agree with Dr. Werner Gitt's definition of universal information that he presented in his 2011 book, Without Excuse. He says universal information is a symbolically encoded, abstractly represented message conveying the expected actions and the intended purposes. In this context, message is meant to include instructions for carrying out a specific task or eliciting a specific response. To bring this back to the genetically inherited ability of birds to know when and where to migrate, we're going to take a look at the building blocks of every living being, of course being DNA. So a DNA is actually composed of two strands of deoxyribose sugar phosphate groups, and they are bridged together by hydrogen bonds between two of the four nucleotide bases, A, T, C, and G, abbreviated. So essentially these four nucleotides constitute the chemical alphabet which is used to write three-letter words, which are called codons, on the chemical paper, the two sugar phosphate strands. It looks like a twisted rope ladder, but a lot more complex. I'd like to reiterate here that while the coded information is conveyed through these nucleotides, it is not defined by it. Information is not the same as the material that conveys it. As such, we can determine, for instance, the information of the navigational direction of migratory birds does not come from the DNA in itself, but from an initial source of intelligence, and that source being God. Evolutionist ornithologists believe that migratory paths started to evolve due to the movement of birds further and further north each year as ice age glaciers retreated. And so they would then return in winter to the traditional non-breeding ground, which lies further away with every generation. However, this does not explain for how many other birds first reached the more southern destinations, like the Godwits, and how they first encountered the islands of New Zealand. Furthermore, how did these migratory paths become imprinted on their genes so that even juveniles can follow the ancestral routes without having to learn from experienced birds? The GPS information required for these journeys must have been programmed in the bird's DNA. It was unlikely imprinted initially by a series of mutations because that would involve the input of new information that wasn't actually there initially. If I get halfway through an examination and I realize I can't remember any more key points, no matter how much I rewrite or reword what I've already said, I will not get any more marks from the examiner. And I'm talking from experience. Yes. No, you definitely do not get any more marks. And just like this, no series of mutations, which is actually just a rearranging of the genes, could result in the creation of this inherited navigational programming that is observed in birds. This is a pitfall for the Darwinian view of avian migration, which suggests that it is a result of a series of beneficial mutations selected for through natural selection to add new information at the macro level. However, a change in the DNA letters cannot create this information proposed. It would require forward information detailing what these changes are aimed at. If I said, have a cup of tea in a foreign language you do not know, firstly, you wouldn't know who I'm talking to because there are many of you in this room. Are you now all going to grab a cup of tea? Well, hopefully not. Unless you knew the language that I was speaking, you wouldn't be able to even extract the meaning of my words. Not only this, but if there was no cup, no tea, and you were immobilized so you couldn't even reach for these non-existent ingredients, even by some miracle, if you understood what I said, you wouldn't be able to respond appropriately. Just like this, even if it were impossible for new information to be added to the bird genome, without knowing what parts the change was directed at, or the understanding of the meaning behind the new message, or the knowledge and ability to respond, or even the presence of the parts in the first place, it would be impossible for the new information to confer any functional meaning. All right, in a way, birds are just like computers. And how, you might ask? Basically, birds are also programmed with genetically coded information that gives them the ability to measure their current geographic location and compare the data with their individually programmed destination. And just like any computer requires the correct machinery to read, translate, and carry out the desired outcome of the program, birds too are equipped with the correct machinery to do all of these things. The information encoded using the DNA is first read by the RNA polymerase complex, which is composed of 4 different proteins and a 5th which tells it where to start reading. The RNA polymerase complex is actually kind of like a mini machine, and it basically runs along the DNA strand, and it is really important for it to know exactly where to start the transcription and where to end the transcription of DNA into RNA, because there are different parts of the DNA transcript which are meant for different things. So basically this transcription process then results in 3 different types of DNA which are crucial for synthesizing the proteins that make up the machinery, for instance, to use to sense magnetic fields, for instance. So like those special proteins we talked about earlier that are found in the eyes of birds, or are thought to be found in the eyes of birds. If even one of these processes or machinery involved in the synthesis of a protein from DNA was missing, it would mean that the bird would not have the equipment required to receive, process, or respond to the external and internal cues that allow the bird to navigate. It is hard to believe when we see the complexity and interdependency of these processes involved in bird navigation, to believe that it has arisen from a series of random mutations. Just like a machine needs all its parts to carry out the task which it was designed to do, the bird's ability to navigate could not arise without all the machinery that allows it to function in its given task. This concept of irreducible complexity is a hurdle for Darwinists who suggest that the machinery evolved from a lot fewer parts, but with each part being valuable in and of itself before the other parts had been created. Some may say that the irreducible complexity is but a gap in understanding. However, we observe its presence when a system ceases to function after we remove any of the given parts. Michael Behe was the first to describe this phenomenon of irreducible complexity in the 1990s. He uses the analogy of a mousetrap. I'm sure many of you were wondering what that was for. A mousetrap consists of 5 interacting parts. So we've got the base, the spring, the hammer, the catch, and the metal restraining bar as well. So if any one of these pieces were to be removed, the mousetrap would not be able to function as it should. For instance, if the hammer was removed, the mouse would not be caught. If the spring was removed, the hammer wouldn't be able to work with the platform to catch the mouse, and it would just scurry away. If you removed the catch or the metal restraining bar, you wouldn't be able to set it up for later action. So instead of actually catching the mouse, it might actually catch your poor finger when you're trying to set it up. So yeah, you don't want to do that. And if the base were to be removed, all the components couldn't be arranged correctly so that they could work together. As you can see, for the trap to perform its function, it requires all of the parts to be of the correct size, be arranged in the correct position, and made of the appropriate material in working order. Just like this, biological functions, like the navigational capabilities of birds, requires multiple parts, or even multiple systems working together in order to correctly navigate on its journey. For instance, if we remove the bird's eyes, we would no longer be able to navigate according to the celestial compasses, which require the perception of light to discern direction. Potentially, we might not even be able to navigate using the magnetic compass, if indeed it is a light-dependent compass mechanism. Within the sun compass itself, there are many parts which work together to provide direction. So if the clock gene was mutated and made the bird's internal clock non-functional, the bird would not be able to adjust for the apparent movement of the sun across the sky as a time shift, and therefore couldn't obtain absolute geographical direction. It is highly improbable that impersonal evolutionary mechanisms could build integrated structures like this directly. Now, I'm not a mathematician. However, I think it would be fairly okay to say that the probability of so many individual parts coming together, each with their right arrangement to create even just one part of the sun compass, would be quite low. And imagine the probability of not only the individual parts of one compass mechanism coming together to form a functional system, but the probability of all of the different compass mechanisms coming together to form the overall navigational system that birds use to follow one integrated sense of direction. Again, this is actually not a gap in understanding, because we see that intelligent designers create irreducibly complex objects all of the time. This is because they have foresight or are able of utilising forward information which a naturalistic explanation simply cannot account for. If new information could in fact be added by a mutation, so the protein that senses the magnetic field was created, what benefit would it have if the correct wiring wasn't in place to deliver that information to the brain? For the bird to navigate using the magnetic compass and the function to confer some advantage that results in the natural selection of this benefit, all the machinery would actually have to be present. This again is a stumbling block for evolution and reinforces the idea that complex machinery must be created instantaneously. Instantly created with all the correct proteins in the right places, all the neurons wired to the correct places in the brain, and the program that interprets the data from the magnetic field to in turn give the bird a sense of direction. To me, that actually really speaks very strongly for the existence of an intelligent design and an even more intelligent creator. To insist we should hold out for a natural explanation when the clues so clearly point to an intelligent cause is like refusing to believe that a dead body containing 9 bullet holes points to murder, because maybe we just haven't figured out the natural explanation. We have very positive reasons to think God is the cause of the apparent design we see in biology and cosmology. For example, we know not only that the proposed evolutionary mechanisms cannot create the high degree of complexity we see and the specific coded instructions like we find in the DNA of living things, but we also see that intelligent agents can do exactly that on a regular basis. But many effects like the complexity of bird navigation, the human genome, and physical constants embedded in nature could not have been produced by human beings. In fact, we are still grappling to understand many of these things, as you know, we even talked about before with the magnetic compass system. So, as such, an infinitely more intelligent and powerful designer must be responsible. And that speaks to me of the God of all creation. I hope tonight you have really enjoyed taking this journey with me. I hope that next time you see a bird, even the one that snatches your sandwich, you might look at them with just more awe than you usually would because you know a tiny bit more about how some of them are capable of successfully navigating across the globe. Even more, my hope is that you might see how these small creatures have been programmed and designed by a wonderful creator, and how all of his creation, his masterpiece, is the proclamation of his wisdom through its intelligent design. The Bible speaks of this in Job 12, verse 7 to 10. It says, "But ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky, and they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of all of these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature, and the breath of all mankind." For those of us who are already believers, I hope you're amazed at the detail and the care that our God has put in these birds so that they are fed safe and always know how to find their way back home. I hope that you marvel at how much he cares for these birds, and you would be humbled and comforted by how much more he cares for you. Thank you so much. I feel so privileged to be here tonight.
Red has a question.
If a migratory bird that flies from south of Australia up to Canada was taken to Africa, would it find its way back to Canada?
Actually, yes, it would. There's been many experiments done where these birds have been displaced, actually really large distances from their breeding grounds, and they actually found that these birds still could find their way to the correct destination. Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? Yeah.